Thank you, Madam President and members. I too rise in opposition to this bill for a couple of reasons. One is that one of the policies that would be preempted by this bill has to do with local authority to regulate the hours and scheduling of work time. In other words, the fair scheduling bill that I'm the chief author of here in the Senate. There has been some discussion in some communities about what to do with this. Nothing has moved forward yet in any communities. But the issues that caused this bill to be drafted, these concerns that have been raised, is when employees don't have any predictability of when they're going to be working the next week, when they're on the beck and call of their employer, where they can be called in and then canceled within short notice, even after they've made scheduling arrangements to be there. For example, people who are on hourly wages, often in the retail industry, if they need to be able to plan for doctor's appointments for themselves or for their children, parent-teacher conferences, college classes, yet they don't get notice often from their employers as to when to expect to be at work, or they are expected to show up on very, very short notice if the employer calls them and says, you've got to be here. I heard of one case where they were called, told they had to be there, made the arrangements last minute for a babysitter, showed up at work and was told immediately, oh, sorry, we don't really need you, go back home. So that the worker was out a lot of money to take care of their family at home. Or if they get scheduled for late closing hours and then told to come back in very short order the next morning to do opening hours. Things like that which make it very, very difficult for people to have stable lives for themselves and for their families. And the bill that's under consideration here today would preempt local governments from trying to find a way to make that kind of a regulation work, in cooperation, by the way, with local businesses that would be affected by this. But there's another reason why I oppose this bill. This bill would stifle the cauldron of innovation and experimentation that our local governments have proven to be. Sort of the federalism analysis that applies to state government. When local organizations or communities like Minneapolis or St. Paul or Duluth are trying to figure out how to make a minimum wage work in their communities, for example, or other local regulations work in their community, they go through the community process, they come up with ideas, they take input, and they figure out approaches that they think will work for their communities. Now, some of those approaches may work better than others. And some ideas that St. Paul has to deal with a situation with the identical question may be different than the way that Minneapolis approaches it or Duluth approaches it. And we would find out, if we allow the local communities the opportunity to try these out, we would find out which ones work well, which ones don't work so well, which unintended consequences would flow from one solution to a problem versus another solution. And then we would learn from that as policymakers. And as this happens statewide in Mankato or in Lakeville or in St. Louis Park, where I served on the city council for 9 years, and we figure out what works well and what doesn't work well, then we would be in a better position as a state to pick and choose among the ones that work the best if we're going to make a well-informed policy decision. But to shut down the innovation that occurs in our local communities would really be bad news for the future of good statewide policy. Now, one example I will give you is one that I worked on for many years in this legislature when I was first elected to the House in 2002, and which we finally passed in 2007 after I came over to the Senate. And that was the smoking ban, the extension of the Clean Indoor Air Act to restaurants and bars and service clubs. And we tried initially to pass a statewide effort, and it was unsuccessful. Lots of questions were raised, questions that we weren't able to answer to the satisfaction of a consensus in the legislature. So what happened is communities across the state, Beltrami County, from the north to the south, east to the west, started passing local ordinances. And some ordinances did one thing, and some ordinances approached a little bit differently. And after a number of local communities had passed ordinances, we came back at the state and looked at them and said, what worked and what didn't? And what would be the best statewide policy? And at that point, this body could make a much better informed decision about how to shape the statewide policy on that. And we did eventually do that. But it was better only because there was the room for local governments to innovate and experiment. Members, some of this comes down to the question of how much do we really trust our local governments? Now, for those of you who have come here after having served in local government, you'll understand this very well because you will value the work that you did, and you understand the quality of your colleagues at a local level and the terrific local community input that you get when you pass an ordinance one day and you walk out the day after it becomes effective and you can see the immediate impact in your own community. But for those of you who haven't come through the local level of government as a public servant, you may perhaps not have that same level of trust. In fact, you may have a distrust or lack of confidence in your local government's ability to do the job right. And I would respectfully suggest to you that you should have more trust in your local governments than this bill seems to suggest that you would have. You know, there's this concept of federalism that I mentioned before is one that was championed by President Ronald Reagan. We had national debates, and we still hear it today. We still hear it today in Washington where they're saying we need to move things back to the states, give more power to the states, devolve national power to the state level because the states will have the ability to be the places where you can try out policies, where you can experiment. You hear it in the health care debate nationally. You hear it in Medicaid issues. You hear it in all sorts of areas of public policy. And there's a real reason why that is an important principle, a principle that Ronald Reagan championed when he was president. Give the states the authority to have to try out some policies, to see what works and what doesn't. The whole concept of federalism works just as principally here in a state when you're dealing with local units of government, whether they're school districts or they're cities, municipalities, county boards, whether you're a charter city or you're a statutory city, the same principle applies. Allow the cities to have some authority to try things out and to see what works and what doesn't work. And we may find that things aren't as bad as some people are predicting. And either way, we will learn from the experience. And if in a few years we come back and we see that some of our local communities have tried some of this and it makes some sense to do it statewide, then maybe we can have a more informed decision. And if we decide it doesn't make any sense to do it statewide, again, that will be a much better informed decision. So I, for one, will stand with my local city councils, with my cities that have passed resolutions opposing this. You know, I tell you, it seems to be that there is very little confidence in our local governments because I looked at what Senator Franzen handed out, and that list of state bills that have been introduced that would preempt local governments. I mean, how many pages do we have it here? This is a legislature right now that seems to have a very strong interest in preempting local government from doing all sorts of things. I would suggest that would be an inappropriate irrigation of power by the state legislature. It's not just on one issue relating to labor standards. It's a broad principle that apparently many members of this legislature adhered to, which is we know better than everyone at the local level, than all of our constituents who have meaningful input at the local level. I would suggest that for most of these bills that aren't going to go anywhere, this should be one of them. Vote no.